Welcome, Johnny.
Here's some scripture, Deuteronomy 8, 7 to 10. This was written about 3,000 years ago. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, and fig trees, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing. You shall eat your fill and bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. It's Deuteronomy about 3,000 years ago. Can you imagine in the last couple hundred years how many tens of millions of immigrants coming to America? That's in their mind. We're going to go to a place where there's all the food we want to eat. And the book's actually has several parts to it. One part of the book is a list of all the different foods they had available at the time and the methods they used to prepare it. So a big part of the book is just about the foods they ate and how they prepared it. Another part of the book is how they distributed the food. Who got the food? Was it everybody just sharing? I mean, how did that work? That's my favorite part, is how the food was distributed. A third part of the book is when we found some interesting aspects of first century life. We highlighted some of the aspects of first century life in the book. And a fourth part of the book is about the feasts. Now, the guy that wrote this with me, Doug Neal, he loved all the different types of feasts they had. They had all kinds of feasts back then. So about the second half of the book really goes through different types of feasts and how to celebrate them. Now, one of the things about the Israelites, they had a system of social welfare designed to help the poor members of their community, and even the non-Jews and strangers in the part of their community. This system was designed to help those who were most powerless, especially widows and orphans. Farmers were required to allow the poor to glean and to go through their fields and orchards and to gather what the harvesters had missed and left behind. Here's the law from Deuteronomy. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheep in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what's left. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather your grapes from your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Also, in Leviticus, which I find even more fascinating, the ancient Jews were not allowed to, they weren't allowed to reap, to harvest from the edges of their field. The poor had the right to go in to the edges of the field and get what they needed if they were hungry for that day. Now, there's another verse in Leviticus that says they cannot bring the sickle into the field. You can't go steal somebody's crops. But if you're hungry, you can go into the crops and take some into your apron so you can have some grain to eat that day. As a matter of fact, there's two verses, one in Mark and another one in Luke, where Jesus gets in trouble for going into a field and getting grain. Not for stealing it, he went in and got it on the Sabbath. So that's what he got in trouble for. So the people, it's kind of fascinating. The common people actually had the right to go into the fields and get what they needed to eat. And this was a primitive method. And they didn't get shelter, but at least they didn't starve to death. And also, there's two other things I'll talk about quickly about the distribution system. One is every 3 years, you had to take 10% of your crops. Now, let's say you got a 50-acre farm and you got 30 acres of wheat and barley. You'd have to take 10% of your crops. Let's say you get 400 bushels out of that 30 acres at a good year. You'd have to take 40 bushels down to the community warehouse. The community warehouse is for the widows, the orphans, the priests. 10% every 3 years. So not only are the gleaners getting to hit the edges of your field and take what they need if they need it, but they also have a community warehouse for the poor. And this is their right. It isn't something the farmer does out of the good of his heart. He does it because he wants to be a good Jew, and that's what the Jewish law says to do. Now, the other thing they had is to think about is, remember, the other farm with 50 acres, he had a warehouse about 10 meters by 10 meters. That's a family storehouse. The family storehouse was the banking system of the first century. He could store 5-6 years worth of food. They had these 7-gallon amphorae jars, earthen jars. They'd drop them into the ground and seal them up. You could store about 7 years worth of grain, wine, olive oil, and in that warehouse. And if your neighbor, if he had a bad year, his warehouse got hit by the enemy coming out and robbing him. If he had a bad year and didn't have food, he had a call on your warehouse. In Deuteronomy it says let me read what it says. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community, in any of your towns within the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand willingly, lending to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near. Therefore, view your needy neighbor with hostility and give him nothing. Your neighbor might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and ungrudgingly when you do so. For on this account, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be someone in need in the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. Deuteronomy 15:7-11. And the 7th year thing, there's strict rules for repayment of what you loan your neighbor. But if he can't get it paid back by the 7th year, you go ahead and forgive it. That's what the 7th year thing is. And interestingly, so Peter goes up to Jesus and he says, oh, and by the way, guys, there's a lot more up here. Come on up here and get some more. Peter goes up to Jesus and he says, well, what the Pharisees say is you only have to forgive 7 times. Is that right? Is you only have to forgive 7 times? And Jesus says, and they're not talking about forgiving because he said, your girlfriend was up. I mean, we're talking about forgiving a year's worth of food here. So he says, is that right? You have to forgive every 7 times? And Jesus says, no, you got to forgive 70 times 7. In other words, it's more important that you share what you have with your neighbor and keep your community together than it is keeping it for yourself. Now, this idea of letting the poor come and get what they need out of your fields, that probably worked pretty good about 3,000 years ago when nearly everybody lived on a farm and had a farm. There weren't that many poor people around. But as time would go on, and by the way, back then you had your taxes for your poor. You had the 10% you paid every 3 years. You had letting them have part of your grain, and the king kept an army, and you had to pay 5% or so into the king's army. And as time went on, Herod the Great raised the tax rate to 15%. And he taxed toll roads, and he taxed the fish. And he raised the tax to a level to where people's farms got foreclosed on if they couldn't pay the tax. And what happens when people's farms get foreclosed on, now you get more poor people. So you get more poor people pulling out of the fields. They got the taxes up. Well, over a period of time, your family warehouse that you use, with your neighbors getting on it, it's draining down. So it's by the time you raise your taxes to 15%, and the other piece of evidence we have is there's a very significant amount of food It was grain, it was pickled fish, it was wine and olive oil that was being shipped to Rome. Well, what happens when you ship the food to Rome? Well, somebody in Jerusalem that owned that big farm got a bucket of silver, and the people that had been eating off it for the last millennium, they didn't have food anymore. See? As food leaves, I mean, we did this in South America. We went down there and helped them set up lots of corporate farms of soybeans, and the soybean oil went to Japan, and people didn't have beans and rice to eat anymore. I mean, this isn't, it was still going on. I mean, so now there's some scholars that say as much as 70% of the land in Jesus' time had been foreclosed on by the rich and had been turned into corporate farms. Some scholars say it's 30%. I think it's both numbers. I think it was probably around 30 or 40% around Jesus' time, but it was getting foreclosed on pretty quickly. And by the time it got to be about 70%, everybody knows what happened in the year 70, and don't you? And a riot. People with farms don't have time to riot. They got to get food out of the ground. But if you've got half your people walking around without their farms being foreclosed on, well, they had some huge riots, and by the time the second century was midway through, the Romans had wiped the Israelis out from the area because of the riots. This is what caused the riots. It wasn't using Jesus' teaching to take care of the poor and to have a Jubilee year. It's his first sermon. Have a Jubilee year to redistribute the land. That wasn't causing the riots. What caused the riots was the corporate farms shipping the food to Rome, and the people's farms being foreclosed on. So I view the teachings of Jesus a little different now after studying this for several years. Let's get off the food distribution and on to what they ate. Most of what they ate was grains and legumes, just like what's up here on the table. The grains were barley, and legumes were barley beans, garbanzo beans. Hummus is a chickpea, it's a garbanzo bean. Wheat, spelt, lentils, and garden peas. Now, the grains was probably, and legumes were probably 60, maybe 70% of their diet. Now, for vegetables, they had lettuce. It's not like iceberg. It's more like dandelions and mustard greens, more like greens. They had lettuces and cucumbers, garlic, leeks, onions, spinach, shallots, mustard, artichokes, beets, cabbage, celery, asparagus, parsnips. They had nuts, almonds, walnuts, pine nuts, pistachios. They had fruits, crab apples, quince, apricots, figs, grapes, olives, blackberries, figs, again, pomegranates, melons, and citrons. They had lots of herbs, like we were talking about earlier. They had parsley, sage, thyme, fennel, mint, coriander, dill, anise. They had spices, cumin, coriander seed, mustard, pepper, saffron, cinnamon, poppy seeds, sesame seeds. Sesame seeds, by the way, the sesame seeds are ground up into chickpeas to make this hummus. So that's what they ate. They had a little bit of meat. They had chickens and doves and yard birds. They clipped their feathers and they kept them. And they had eggs. And they had some goats. They had a few goats and sheep. Not too many cows. Most of the milk, most of the cheese they made from the sheep's milk and the goat's milk. And of course, the reason they made the cheese and the yogurt is because if they left it in the whole milk form, it would spoil. But if you go ahead and you drop some lemon or some rennet in it, and you get the whey out, you separate the solids from the liquid in the milk, you can make cheese, and it lasts 3 to 5 times as long as the milk would. And so they had cheese, but they might have eaten meat or fish on a Sabbath meal or every other Sabbath meal. I'm talking about the regular people, the common people of the land. It was pretty much what's on the table. It was pretty much what made their diet. And this would have been a big lunch, but a very common lunch for the first century. And now the feasts are different. The feasts are different. People are going to have a big feast. They're going to go to Jerusalem. They're going to buy a land, take it to the temple. They're going to the priest is going to, once the priest will skin the lamb, another one will take the blood and throw it on the altar. Another priest will take maybe a leg of the lamb for the priest, and you take the rest of the lamb home and you eat it for your feast. But, you might get lamb or twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, maybe once a year. So there's no refrigeration, and they celebrated, and you read about the fatted calf. Remember that? They killed the fatted, but they did. They kept the fatted calf if they had a pretty good size spread. Pretty good. And when a very special meal, a very special event would come along, like I guess we heard the prodigal son coming along, when the prodigal son came along, they killed that special fatted calf and had a big feast. Somehow one of the sons wasn't too happy about that. That's another story. Meat didn't happen like it did for us. Meat was sometimes once a year, sometimes once a quarter. Not counting chicken and fish. A little bit of that on Sabbath, Sunday. During the week, not going to happen. This is what's going to be eaten during the week. And as far as the lentils, this one's got onions and carrots in it. I could have also made another stew. I put parsnips and these other vegetables, especially the root vegetables I was reading, and put cabbages, and I could have put another one in here. But really, that's how they eat their vegetables. They fix them up in a stew. They take and put a pot in the middle, and the family would sit down and take the chunks of bread and tear it. I've got some illustrations to that here in the book. But that's how they ate. Now, yes.
Was there any variation? Is that what they usually do? Would that be breakfast and supper?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And you if you're working in the field, they might bring, if there's several of you, if it's a harvest type thing, they might bring a pot of lentils out to you. Otherwise, you take some of these loaves, little loaves, or we call them rolls, and you'd open them up and you'd throw some of last night's cheese in there, or some of last night's hummus in there, and you'd put them in your shepherd's bag, and you'd go on and move. So they did have eggs. They had eggs every now and then. But the biggest variation came with the seasons, when the fruit trees came in, you're going to get a lot more fruit in your diet for the next month and a half. And then they would dry what they didn't eat. And during the next year, they would bring it back. And of course, if you boil like apricot, or you put it in some hot water, it will reconstitute. And then they'd take those. If we were having a feast, it wouldn't look like this. I mean, we'd have yogurt. I'd have made some yogurt, which is not hard to make. And I would have taken some apricots and reconstituted them and chopped them up and mixed them in that yogurt along with some honey, and it would have been pretty tasty. It would have been a real nice dessert. So, I mean, it's not like this is all they got all the time. But this is most of what they got. But they did get the yogurt. They did have the fruits. And they dried the fruits, and then the dried fruits will keep for about a year till the next harvest comes up. So you can imagine the warehouse, like I say, is maybe 10 meters by 10 meters. It's you put a little ladder in, you go down, and there's some holes in the ground. These amphorae jars are like a cone. You would set the jar down in there. And it might last, like say, 5-6 years if it was a grain maybe that long if it was a wine. They might have jars of vinegar where vegetables, the dried vegetables don't dry quite as well. Well, legumes do, and don't dry quite as well as the fruits. So they'd take maybe the onions and some of the other vegetables and carrots, and they'd put them in vinegar. It would last another 6 months or so in the vinegar. In fact, if like I say, if this wasn't a common lunch, if this was a feast, I would have had a jar of vegetables and vinegar, and you would have taken some pickled vegetables and eaten those. So it was fruits, it was grains first, legumes second, vegetables third, and fruits fourth, cheese fifth. Those were the order of what they consumed, and there wouldn't have been any type 2 diabetes because you're not going to get type 2 diabetes eating what's on the table here. That comes from the sugars. And they had honey. They had honey that would have gone in a wedding cake, would have gone in the yogurt dessert I was talking about for a feast. And they had a harvest feast. They had a Toda feast. They had, of course, the Passover feast. They had the feast of. They had half a dozen feasts, and those were big deals, and they had a great time. And that's when they took the vegetables out and the wine that they would have had for a big feast. They would have only diluted it 1-to-1 with water. For a common meal, it'd be 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 water to wine. I think it almost did as good a job as taking the bacteria out of the water as it did and giving them a few calories to eat as anything else. But literally, the only thing that would have been a cause of type 2 diabetes in the first century would have been what was in that wine, the way we process alcohol. Yes?
What about olives?
Oh, olives. Olive oil was a really big deal. I forgot to talk about that. If you take an olive, for one thing, olives get ripe about September, October. And if you take an olive that isn't quite ripe, it's green, and you squeeze it, you get a little bit of moisture out of it, but no oil. You take an olive that's ripe and you squeeze it into a teaspoon, you may get half a teaspoon of olive oil. They did not grow the olives to eat. They grew them for the olive oil. Olive oils would go in the lamp. Olive oil would go in the stew. Olive oil was a cooking oil. Olive oil would make soap out of it. Olives were a really big deal. As a matter of fact, if you had to have a couple of day laborers during the day to help harvest the grapes, the wife would run down to the market with about a half a liter of olive oil, maybe a liter, because she had 2 laborers, and she'd go to the olive oil vendor, and he'd give her back two drachma, 2 day wages, and she'd bring that back for it. So the food was money. Food was 70% of their diet, of their budget, maybe 80% of their budget. So food was like money to them back then, which is why feasts were such a big deal. Or why loaning your neighbor the food wasn't like giving them a can for beans for the food pantry. It's like you're giving them all your savings account. So it was food was money back then. And now olives. The other part about the olives is if you've got the ripe olives, you knock them down. You can take your olive oil. What do you do with unripe olives? You throw them in a jar of salt. They take a slice of them, and you slice them and throw them in a jar of salt. And it takes the bitter chemical out, and you can eat that green olive later. And we've been eating green olives for thousands of years. and we get used to the taste, but trying to give a baby a green olive, they're not going to. It's an acquired taste. They're not going to like it. So, but the olives were a really big deal because the olive oil was their liquid currency. See, the olives, the feast. I don't think I mentioned anything about. I talked a lot about food distribution. This guy here, When Herod died, the first Herod, now Herod had 3 sons that he left. He had a lot of sons. He killed several of them. But he had the 3 sons that he left his kingdom to. Herod, and Herod. But they had other names too. That's why we get Herods mixed up, because there's so many of them, back then. And his big kingdom became 3 kingdoms. But when he died, this guy named Josephus published he had published for the Romans. He wrote a history of ancient Israel, and he wrote up Herod's will. And he left Augustus Caesar. This guy Herod, he was a smart reason. He hooked up with Julius Caesar, and then when Julius Caesar got taken out, he didn't hook up with any of the guys that took turns trying to take over Rome. He waited until Augustus Caesar got in there, and then he became buddies with Augustus. So anyway, he left Augustus Caesar 10 million drachmas. Well, if you take a day wage and you calculate it, that's just about $1 billion. He left 5 million drachmas to other people and 500,000 to Salome. It's all laid out there, what he had and who he left it to. But it's just not the land, just the treasury was about $1.7 billion. And you hear this, well, Herod didn't tax him any higher than anybody else. It was the Romans. Herod took 15%. The Romans wanted 5 of that. And Herod and his friends have foreclosed on a huge part of the kingdom. And that food's going to, and the money's going to the treasury. How do you get to be a billionaire out of some farmers in the first century? You've got to hit them pretty hard with taxes and foreclosures in order to collect that kind of money. Anyway, Herod left the money, most of it to Caesar, so Caesar would what do you call it, when they probate the will and split the kingdom up, and the kids he promised it to got that. But besides the food distribution, the book's got all kinds of feasts they did. It's got all kinds of foods they ate and how they prepared, and interesting stuff about the first century. It's like the wedding chapter on the wedding feast. I mean, what you got is you got a 25-year-old guy that's got a trade, say. He knows how to take care of himself, and he goes and he buys a 13-year-old girl from her father. And he pays some money to the father, and they have some money set aside for the dowry. I think the root of the word betrothed, I think, means to purchase. and so he waits a year till she's 14. He gets the money together. He comes back. He gives part of it to the family. He gives part of it to the dowry. And he brings her home to his mother, who teaches her how to cook for that family and how they like it. And you can imagine having a political discussion with men, and these guys are 25 to, let's say, 30 years old, and talking about things. Who's going to want a 15-year-old girl on that discussion? The life back then isn't like it is now. It isn't like it is now. So we have a little bit of stuff in there about getting some perspective on the life of the first century. But mostly it's about what they ate, how they split the food up, what the Jewish laws and customs were, and what was going on in the first century.
Yeah, the point is before, in the Middle East particularly, Jews, why are some of these stories not big?
Oh, well, that's a good question. There weren't any Muslims back then.
I'm not talking about focus about Jews.
I know. But there weren't any Muslims back then.
600 years later.
So everybody else that wasn't Jewish was Gentile. So they, let's say where Jesus was, his area, somewhere around half the people were Jews and the other half were Gentiles. I mean, when they would catch catfish or shrimp or things like that, they wouldn't pull them back. They'd sell them to the Gentiles. So there was lots of pigs. And the Romans and the Greeks, that was their primary meat. They thought the Jews were nuts.
So much piques my interest, but one thing you mentioned, vinegar and pickling. Does that mean that virtually every vegetable back then was pickled?
Not when it's fresh. You know, how long is the vegetable? We got refrigeration. You know, broccoli can keep a long time in my refrigerator. They had cauliflower. They didn't actually have that. They had cauliflower. How long is the cauliflower going to keep sitting out? See, it's going to turn over. So you eat them while they're fresh, and what you don't eat while it's fresh, you throw it in the vinegar jar while it's still got some before it goes bad, and let it pickle up. So you know, how long does a carrot last while it's sitting out? You know, not as long as it does in a jar of vinegar.
Did you look in your research in terms of what they ate and trade? That is, how much of what they ate did they go, and how much did
That's a good question. Especially when Herod's deal came along. Okay. How much did the common person eat? Did they produce themselves? And how much did they maybe pick up from their neighbor? Well, ideally, you know, like I say, you'd have like about 50 acres, and you'd have 10 acres of barley and 20 acres of wheat, and you'd have a 5-acre vegetable garden and a 5-acre vineyard and 10 acres of orchards, and you'd have everything you needed, except you'd have to barter some of that to the potter. They'll make you some of those amphory jars, and maybe some to a carpenter to help you build an extra room on. But some of the farms, they just grew the one thing. Maybe they just grew olives. Maybe they just had orchards. And then they would have to trade their oil for grain. The olive oil for grain, and trade their fruits for grain. A lot, in fact, food was money. When they weren't throwing around coins like we do. They were bartering for what they needed. If they needed cloth, they were more likely to trade their produce for it than their money. They used the money to pay those damn taxes. I could sit down in church. I guess it's okay, I'm not in there. Yes.
Now, how about the role of fish?
Well, fish, the Sea of Galilee is about the size of Lake Dallas. Okay, Lake Dallas looks like an elm leaf. Sea of Galilee look more like a pear. But it's about 200 feet deep, and fish do real well there. The primary fish in the lake in the Sea of Galilee is tilapia. But the fish didn't go. How far, when you're carrying a fish, how far, you know, you can make 10 miles a day, how far did the fish get away from the lake, you know? See, so the biggest part of the fish weren't really eaten, unless you lived around within, say, 10 miles of that lake or so. The biggest part of those fish weren't eaten by the locals. They were pickled. In fact, the primary sauce the Romans used for all the meats, they thought barbarians roasted their meats. They wanted to boil their meats and be sophisticated. But the primary sauce they put on virtually all of them, something they call it like garum, and it's just, you might as well pick up a Vietnamese fish sauce. It's exactly the same thing. It's pickled fish, and they had two grades of it. They had it where they would get rid of the tail and they take the meat or the small sardines, the good fish, and they would let it ferment and mix it with vinegar and salt, and that was the major sauce for the Roman fish. And the other is to take the heads and the junk and then make a low end sauce for the common people. But there was more fish being dried to be reconstituted and pickled than there was being eaten. But the people that lived around the lake had it a little better. They got, Sabbath comes, they're going to get some fish more than once.
You had mentioned something one time about it's in Matthew 23 where Jesus really gets onto the Pharisees and the tithing, you only tithe your student.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's an interesting take on that.
But yeah, here's the deal. And Herod even stopped taxing the priests at one point in time. He wanted to get on their good side. And some of these priests were owning land and farms that had been foreclosed on at this point in time. They didn't used to be. Levites didn't have any land. And that's why original Jewish law written 3,000 years ago, the Mosaic law says you've got to have a community warehouse so the local Levite, the local priest, can get his food out of there. Because he doesn't have land. Well, by the time of Herod, some of these guys had land. And some of these Pharisees had land. And some of these rich people had land. And they would also have at their house in Jerusalem a garden. And in their garden they would be growing there. What was it I said earlier? Here it is. Coriander, sesame seeds, thyme, fennel, parsley. They'd be growing their dill, their anise. They'd be growing all their spices in their gardens. So they'd have plenty of spice to load up their lentils when they had their lentils. But they would sanctimoniously, the people in Jerusalem, even though they were owning the corporate farms, they were taking the food out of the farms and turning it into the buckets of silver once they traded it to the Romans. They would sanctimoniously take 10% of their garden herbs and take it down to the temple. Look what I'm doing. Look what I'm doing my 10%. And
I've got the verse for you.
Oh, go ahead.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these that you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. And then he finishes with, you blind guide, you straight on a gnat, but swallow a camel.
And you mentioned the camel thing. In today, it's hard to think this camel, rich person, hard going through the eye of a camel, ninja. It's hard to kind of get that today because, you can come up with a software application and you can make some really good money and you're not really oppressing anybody necessarily. But the only way you could get rich in the first century was to foreclose on your neighbor's farms. When Jubilee come, don't give it back to them. Make them work as tenant farmers to where they don't have anything. Take the produce, ship it to Rome, get a bucket of silver, and you can become a rich guy. That's about the only way you could become a rich guy in the first century. So when Jesus says it's hard for them to be righteous, it's hard for them to be righteous. And how when you're righteous then, I don't think the Jews were talking about going to heaven. I mean, they're talking about being a good Jew. About following the law. They're going to follow the law. If they're really a good Jew following the law, how come they're rich? And the people working on the farms don't have enough to eat because it got sent to Rome. Yes.
Joe, do you grow any of your herbs?
Yeah, I try. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I have the try is the only thing.
And we've got a room inside the house that's got light, a lot of light, kind of sunroom we made. And they grow real good in there, but a lot of times in the summer they don't grow so good in the direct sunlight. Spring, they do it in spring. Yes.
Well, Joe, this is delicious.
Yeah.
Absolutely delicious. I mean,
Thanks.
Every way.
I mean, if common people were eating like this, God bless them. This is really, really delicious. And since it's so delicious and so healthy, I mean, why aren't there restaurants where we can go and
It's like culture. It's culture. We're not used to eating like this. We're used to eating hamburgers. It's a culture thing. There's been a number of Middle Eastern grocery stores and restaurants come and go in Dallas in the last 20 years. And this is what you'd get there. It's a falafel, and there's one that's up on the Hillcrest and between Hillcrest and Preston on the Beltline. And there's one left there now. There was another one there on the backside of Galilee. It's been there about 15 years. It's gone now. One at Midway's gone. It's the culture. People are used to eating steak in Texas and not lentils. These lentils aren't a big seller. I mean, I almost missed them. I was looking for them in the Tom Thumb. I mean, I know where they are in the Sprouts and the Home Depot. I was looking for a bag of the Tom Thumb. I almost missed them. There was about half a dozen 1-pound bags back there.
Yeah, but again, it's so delicious. It seems to me that if they were rightly promoted and easily available, I could visualize myself pulling through McDonald's and asking for all the lentils.
Yeah, I see your point, and it sounds fair, but I can't imagine my kids doing it. I can't imagine my kids doing it. I mean, they've started, they're pushing 30 now, we're not 40 something. And their mother would always bring them McDonald's nuggets every night. And they'd say, Dad, what are you fixing us this chicken for? It's healthy food. They're starting to eat healthy food now. But for decades, they wanted that salt and sugar that they sell us in the fast foods. They're selling sugar and they're selling salt in the fast foods. And
you say that right before we're about to die.
What?
He said that right before we're about to die. Ice cream.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to eat it anyway.
you got to think we're going to get back there when we come in life.
Well, you know what thing it is about because of the immigrants. Because my friend Trudy, she and I searched those restaurants out. We tried to eat together about 4 times a year. And she lives way over there. And we found some Ethiopian restaurants.
Yeah.
Arab restaurants. Some really, oh my God, please God. And you can find them online.
I mean, these immigrants are going to save us.
Yeah, the immigrants are really healthy in that area.
They actually make the Social Security system work, too.
Okay.
But that's another story. But I hope we come in light. I hope we get back to eating.
Oh, we may have to.
I hope we do. I pray we do. Because this will keep us healthy. This will make us live longer.
I think we should give Joel a hand for the wonderful discussion. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Kim Batchelor. I coordinate the Dallas Area Christian Professional Alliance, so I apologize I'm not doing that. But while our preparers of ice cream would like to take that out, I was just going to bring up a couple of things that we wanted to end this with, and that is our reminder that not everyone even has so much food on their tables, and that hunger is a huge problem. And just to give you a couple of clues of ways that you can be involved with that issue if you don't already know, one of the organizations I think that does a lot for this is Bread for the World. And you can go to their website, they have quite a bit there. But one thing I'd also encourage you to do that they're connected with is to go on and sign on for the Circle of Protection, which is an initiative to get people behind protecting some of the safety net programs, especially hunger programs and other programs related to health that are under threat right now. Someone recently discussed, I heard this morning about the potential savaging of the safety net programs and some of the budgets that are being promoted. It's a bipartisan issue where the recent cuts in food stamps are going on. That's not just one party or another. It seems to be happening when we think that, people will do fine if we just, give them an opportunity not to have food on their table. One of the things that I'll never forget, several years ago, that a congressman once told me, he said, if we don't feed children, their brains do not develop, and they suffer the rest of their lives. This isn't just, oh, we got to wean people off of dependency. This is really a life or death, or a situation in which children will not develop if we don't give them that.
Jesus taught people had the right to the food. They could go into the farms and get it. And if the people can't go to the grocery store and get stuff off the end caps now.
Right.
Yeah, they don't work that way.
No, I think you're
So-
right.
Can you say again, I got bread for the world, but what was the other thing?
It's called the Circle of Protection. If you Google Google Circle of Protection, or you can also put circleofprotection.us, and it goes directly to their site. And there's a way to just sign on there. That's a policy and a justice issue. So there's certainly lots of things churches do and can do. I don't minimize that. But I think if we Christians say, it's just the churches, they'll take care of it. One, it's too big of a problem. And two, it neglects the weightier matter of the law, which is the justice issue. Do we as a nation, are we blessed because we feed our hungry people? Or are we accursed because we do not? And that's Jesus in Matthew 25, 31, 45, which we always talk about.
And that's Bread for the World's dilemma right now, because it's not talking about outside of the country, but inside the country, what Bread for the World's program is they're selling food stamps and WIC, which is giving the people the right to go get their food, just like Jesus taught. And you've got lots of Christians making a disconnect and saying, no food stamps, no WIC. We're going to cut it back. We're going to vote for Paul Ryan.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but
That's what their dilemma is right now.
Right.
And they don't really know quite how to embrace that.
And I think the sin of a lot of too many Christians nowadays, unfortunately, is a real rationalization. One is the church and charity, but they'll also say that the poor are lazy and undeserving. And I think those of us who say that, we don't look at the person who's cleaning up after us. We don't understand that Jesus said that's not the issue. When he said invite the poor to your table, they're not going to give you anything. But that's not what it means to be truly righteous people.